Great. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Um, we are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to go back and watch it later. Thanks everyone for your patience, those of you who joined us last week for our webinar with Renelle. I know we had a lot of technical difficulties last week, so we're hoping that those are all resolved today. I've got my headset on so folks can hear me better. Um, for those wondering about the recording of Renelle's webinar, we're re-recording it. She's re-recording her presentation so that we have a better quality version to go up on the YouTube channel. So we will let you know when that's available, so you can go back and rewatch that. So my name is Leah Watkiss. My pronouns are she, her. If you can't see me, I am in my mid-30s. I'm in a light blue shirt sitting against the white background. I have pale skin and sort of medium length curly red hair. And on behalf of the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, I would like to welcome you into this space of learning, and we're very glad that you are joining us today. So we have people joining us from across Turtle Island, but myself as the host today, I'm speaking to you from Toronto or Takaranto, which has been home to many nations since time immemorial. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. These nations were harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to erase these Indigenous communities and their teachings. Colonialism and racism are deeply entrenched in the Canadian state. Collaborative Network to End Exploitation strives to decolonize our work and make a positive contribution to the reconciliation process. Here at CNEE, we also like to do a labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge the labor and sacrifices of poor and racialized workers on these lands. Canada's settler colonial history includes, among others, the exploitation of the labor of over 200 years of enslaving African and Indigenous peoples, charging an immigration head tax on any person of Chinese origin, agricultural and other migrant workers indentured to their employers with closed work permits. These and other violent practices allowed Canada to accumulate wealth and power. Canada continues to profit from the historic and ongoing exploitation of poor and racialized people. CNEE is committed to redressing this legacy. So for our Do No Harm webinar today, a couple of housekeeping pieces. For the majority of the presentation today, you will be muted and chat will be disabled so that we can focus on listening to what our guest speaker has to share. The chat feature will be turned on after the presentation during questions and discussion. But you can private message myself or Varka, my colleague who is also works with me with the CNEE. We are recording this, so you'll have access to the recording later. Oh yes, cart captions. We had planned to have cart captions available, but unfortunately we can't get we're having some troubles there. But we do have the live transcript feature enabled, so you can turn that on if you would find subtitles and captioning of assistance. So today's conversation is part of a larger conversation that CNEE has been trying to facilitate for the last 2 years around reducing harms that are committed or perpetuated unintentionally, often by anti-human trafficking groups. What we're trying to do with our Do No Harm series is highlight and make space for voices of marginalized groups who are sometimes negatively impacted by anti-human trafficking work. These are voices that are pushed to the sides. These are not people who are typically invited to be speakers at anti-human trafficking events. So our goal here today is to bring forward one of many voices of people who have been negatively affected by anti-trafficking practices. So our topic today is It's Not Violence When the Police Do It, State-Sanctioned Violence Under the Guise of Anti-Trafficking Rescue. And then next week, we will conclude our series looking at transgender identities and human trafficking. So thanks for joining us today. Hope you will also join us next week. It's the same Zoom link and at the same time. So a few assumptions as we begin. We are assuming that if you're here today, you are already familiar with the topic of human trafficking and what anti-human trafficking work entails. We are not here to give you human trafficking 101. We are assuming that you are here with good intentions and because you want to learn more. This series comes from a philosophy of know better, do better. So we're really glad that you're open to hearing some different voices and to being challenged. So that brings me to our third assumption, which is that discomfort is a part of growth. With all of our speakers, you may have heard things that make you feel uncomfortable. And we really encourage you, as here at Do No Harm, to lean into that discomfort, because that is where we are going to find the opportunities for growth and learning. So that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Alison Clancey. Alison is the Executive Director of SWAN Vancouver Society, an organization that promotes the rights, health, and safety of newcomer, migrant, and immigrant women engaged in indoor sex work through frontline service and systemic advocacy. Her public education, advocacy, and policy efforts focus on raising much-needed critical awareness of the harms of mainstream anti-human trafficking campaigns, policy, and enforcement. With over a decade of working with police on various sex work and trafficking-related policy, practice, and investigations, she has developed a deep understanding of the risks and limitations of doing so. Thank you so much for being with us today, Alison. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. I'm so very pleased to be here. I'm just checking to make sure that you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, great. So to begin this presentation today, I'd like to share a story, and I'd like to invite audience participation in this. So in this work that I do, I have interactions with all kinds of people. And so I'm going to share one of those interactions. And I'd like to start with a poll. I think that one of the organizers will share in the chat box the poll of a question that I'd like to put out to you. So here is the question. So on March 18th, 2022, so just a couple of months ago, someone said to me, I set up a ruse to lure the girls in a trafficking context conversation. So I'm asking the audience to participate and answer the poll. Who said that? Was that a trafficker or a police officer? So again, just to describe the context, on March 18th, someone said to me, I set up a ruse to lure the girls. Who said that? Was it a trafficker or a police officer? Okay, so I see some answers coming in there. So I will tell you the context and who said that to me. So that was said to me by a Greater Vancouver police officer who was quite proudly describing a raid on sex workers in a hotel. So accompanied by a local women's organization, and I'll address community organizations working with police a little bit later in the presentation, he stated that he had been quite naive acting on a tip of youth trafficking in a local hotel. Instead, sex workers from another province were working, and in no uncertain terms, he said, they informed the police that they were doing just fine, making lots of money. So I start with that example of I set up a ruse to lure the girls to demonstrate the lack of awareness among police of the violence that they perpetuate through their language, in this case, using the language that we would expect to hear from traffickers, and the violence in their actions in anti-trafficking raids and so-called rescue, which is the topic that I'll be discussing today. So this poll that I just presented is indicative of what this presentation is all about. So throughout the presentation today, I will be using police speaking in their own words wherever possible, and you can draw conclusions for yourselves. Because I'm using police speaking in their own words and photos and other media from anti-trafficking rescue initiatives, I'm issuing a content warning about the police anti-trafficking responses and actions. The sounds and the descriptions of these police enforcement actions may be very distressing for some. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, my name is Alison Clancey. I'm situated on the unceded territories of the Kootenai, Sinix, and Silex peoples in British Columbia. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm speaking to you today as the Executive Director of SWAN, and there isn't an immigrant or migrant sex worker from SWAN speaking to you today, as the majority of the women that access our services are non-English speaking, which presents a language barrier that we would need to address if we are doing a presentation like this to an English-speaking audience. And also, because of the risk of surveillance, investigation, arrest, detention, and deportation in speaking out on this specific topic is very real and significant. So at SWAN, women engage in ways that they feel are safe to speak their truths, which this presentation today is not. And as you'll hear later in the presentation, the risk is also significant for our organization to be speaking out on this today, a 20-year-old community-based organization, and also for me personally, as a white, cis, female, English-speaking Canadian citizen, with all of my privilege, you'll come to see the extent to which even I and the organization are criminalized by association to immigrant and migrant sex workers in challenging the state when it comes to anti-trafficking, but I'll provide more details about that a little later. So even though I've been involved in many parts of trafficking frontline support, from removing women from exploitative situations without police to providing shelter and other basic necessities, successfully securing temporary residence permits, supporting criminal justice investigations at the request of victims, repatriation, and continuing to support women once back in the country of origin, I have much more experience advocating against the way in which police address anti-trafficking in the sex industry through both policy and practice. So it's actually rare for our organization to encounter human trafficking. We do from time to time. However, we do work with the stereotypical archetype of the trafficked woman in Greater Vancouver. So that is Asian women who speak English with non-Western accents, or non-English speaking Asian women who do sex work. And it's precisely our work with these women that places us within the anti-trafficking landscape. So while the majority of the women that we interact with have not been trafficked, rather they have been anti-trafficked, meaning they have experienced the negative impacts of ill-informed, harmful legislation, policy, and practice, particularly at the hands of police. So these are women who have been traumatized by police in anti-trafficking raids, lost their jobs, their incomes were cut off, referred to services, community services they did not need or that they asked for, surveilled, arrested, detained, and deported. So just some of the consequences of being on the receiving end of anti-trafficking enforcement actions. So while I'll be speaking about this based on SWAN's experience with immigrant and migrant sex workers who've been anti-trafficked, there are cautions to heed when working with other populations of individuals who may be trafficked. So as I mentioned, SWAN has extensive experience raising awareness of the impacts of state-sanctioned violence that the police do under the guise of anti-trafficking rescue. So for years, we've been a very vocal opponent of police enforcement actions in this area. I have personally interacted with too many police officers and police agencies to count at municipal and provincial levels from coast to coast on the issue of anti-trafficking enforcement. And so here is an example from 2017 when our organization initiated an open letter to decry the tactics that police use to purportedly combat human trafficking. So today in the presentation, I'll be referring quite often to Operation Northern Spotlight, which was created by Durham Police in Ontario in 2015. And for several years, it was a national law enforcement anti-trafficking initiative, which at times involved 50 or 60 police agencies from coast to coast participating. While to my knowledge, Operation Northern Spotlight is no longer being carried out, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, as a national strategy, the strategy is still very much carried out by lone police agencies, as I indicated from the raid, from the poll that I shared at the beginning, which was only a couple of months ago in Greater Vancouver, that this type of law anti-trafficking initiative is still being used. So I'll take you now to two sections about the problem because the problem is immense. So it required two different sections. I'll take you back to 2006 and the problem then and the problem now. So this is quite small print, so I'll read it out. 2006 and SWAN was involved in this anti-trafficking raid. So back in 2006, the headline reads, "Massage parlor raid in BC leads to 100 arrests. Police suspect human trafficking." So I'll just read the highlighted sections. 100 people, more than 100 people were taken into custody after a massive police raid on 18 massage parlors across BC Lower Mainland, Greater Vancouver. Most of those arrested were women who police believe could be victims of human trafficking. So that's the first red flag, arrested victims. The corporal said everyone arrested in the raids had been released, including the women who declined government assistance of emergency shelter. So here I just mentioned previously being offered services they did not need or ask for. He said, while all of the 78 women arrested were legally in Canada, either as citizens or permanent residents, they still could have been exploited and used in the sex trade against their will. But police and social service agencies have just begun the process of building enough trust with the women to get them to confide in investigators. So again, we'll see time after time, the raid is understood by police to be an act of trust building. The probe started when complaints came to the RCMP about massage parlors being used for prostitution. The raid involved more than 200 police officers. So again, you can see the enormous resources that police put towards these anti-trafficking raids. Young women from Asia and South Asian countries are brought to Canada under false pretenses, then forced into prostitution, without any reference to where that assumption comes from or any evidence to that effect. And of the 108 arrested, 78 women, there were 78 of those who were women working in the massage parlors. So it's really distressing to see that that happened in 2006. And it's exactly the same thing that's happening now, 16 years later in 2022. So years ago, these raids and rescues could have been considered ignorance back in 2006 on the part of police, but we can't give the police the benefit of the doubt 16 years later and still using that same playbook that has been met with such criticism from sex workers in particular. So while raids and rescues back then were targeted mostly at racialized sex workers in massage parlors, they are now widespread under the guise of saving the children from sex trafficking, a cause which I would say pulls together diverse, white, middle-class saviors like few other causes. Once the raid started to be indiscriminate and sweep up all sex workers, the vocal opposition by all sex workers became louder. So police and the government who creates the national strategy and funds this, they can no longer say that they're ignorant as to the harms of this approach, yet they persist. However, it's much more complex than doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The need exists to appear to be doing something to address trafficking, but we question the effectiveness of this approach. And in a few minutes, we'll listen to the police in their own words, speaking to how they feel about how effective this is. And there are also police budgets to think about amid the calls of defunding police. And also the war on drugs is not as lucrative for police budgets as it once was. So amidst these calls of defunding the police, we are still not seeing widespread calls to defund police anti-trafficking budgets, which is quite perplexing. People have really bought into the victim, villain, hero narrative, and still see the police as the hero or the good guys in anti-trafficking initiatives. So just moving along. So what exactly are we talking about here when I'm using this raids and rescues? So let me describe it through an experiential exercise. So if you would, could you please close your eyes? So your eyes are closed and just listen to the scene that I will describe. So you are sitting at your place of work, whatever work that may be. You may be working at home or you may be working at a work site. You neither hate nor love your job. It pays the bills. It's an uneventful day. You may be thinking about what you're going to do when you get off work, or perhaps you're thinking about inflation and how you're going to pay your bills this month. So that was just the sound of a police on an anti-trafficking raid. So can you imagine, can you enter into what a rescue raid would actually feel like? You're in your workplace, 6 to 8 armed police officers storm your space. How would you feel? Can you imagine how traumatizing this would be? What we've heard from women is feelings of confusion, fear, and they thought they were being robbed, not being able to identify those storming through the doors as police. On top of that, they may be accompanied by a women's organization or a social worker, whom we'll refer to as Debbie Dogood, ready to offer you shelter or other services that you may not need. So some of the services that you may be offered or resources could be something like this rescue kit. So these are some photos taken from anti-trafficking organizations where they have volunteers preparing rescue kits. And I will read the caption from the largest picture. Many bracelets were made to put a homemade touch on the rescue kits. It is fun for survivors to receive a gift from someone that made something especially for them. So even if you are actually trafficked, are these kits any more appropriate? Are they culturally appropriate? Or is the raid itself any less scary? So we'll look now at actual footage from anti-trafficking raids carried out in Canada. So the first one that I'm going to show you is actual footage from a Canadian sex trafficking raid carried out by Durham Police, the same folks that were the catalyst for Operation Northern Spotlight a number of years ago. In this context, the police allege that they received a report from a 15-year-old who came to them alleging she was lured into the sex trade over social media by two women who were formerly trafficked themselves. So I'll play the video and listen to the Durham police officer describe the outcome of the rescue raid after it was over. Pay attention to the CBC reporter and the questions they are or are not asking. Also pay attention to this line that the police utter: we gotta have fun in this job sometimes. So just bear with me for a moment while I switch screens, and hopefully I don't have too many technical difficulties in doing this. Okay, so here's the police officer describing the raid that they just carried out.
And how did it go today?
Everything went smooth, and everybody was safe, and we arrested one person, and they'll be going to bail court earlier today.
And did you find weapons or anything else?
No, nothing was located as of now. We're still investigating, and we're continuing our investigation.
We've done.
You gotta have fun at this job sometimes, right? Yes.
Right?
Yes, we have. We're bringing these people before the courts and make them held accountable for things they do to these people.
What kind of difference do they? Yeah.
It's a little. It's like taking a spoonful of water out of Lake Ontario, one bit at a time. But we're trying our best, and that's all we can do.
Okay, so just bear with me again while I go back to the main presentation. Okay, and we're back. Okay. So I'll just read through some of the comments that the officer made to just put it a little bit more in context, and if they weren't heard clearly. So there was one arrest made. It was a 20-year-old female, and I took this from the report, who was with her family at the time. So this was a family home that they went into. And the news report said that the two alleged traffickers were young females who were previously recruited themselves. When the reporter asked if there were weapons confiscated, or weapons located, which was the rationale for the police dressing up like this in the SWAT gear, the officer said no, that there were no weapons identified. And this use of this kind of SWAT gear has been a contentious issue that I've personally had with police over the years. I'll just share now what we look like when we go into these same spaces. These are our outreach workers. Albeit we're not going in to escalate a situation, but we are still going into these same spaces. And I'll personally share an experience that we had with the SWAT team. A number of years ago, I sometimes went into a family home to provide outreach. That family home was doubling as a micro brothel. There was a multi-generational family living there. Anytime that I went in, the family was cooking dinner for the family members and also for the women working there. They were often sitting around watching soap operas. Sometime later, like quite similar to what Durham police experienced in this, there was a complaint of underage trafficking. The SWAT team showed up. There were 20 officers in SWAT gear with rifles pointed at the house. This is not the way. Were there labor practices and exploitation, perhaps, that should have been examined among adults? Yes. Was a SWAT team the strategy to address them? Most definitely not. So just returning to the Durham raid, the statement, gotta have fun in this job sometimes. I just ask you to draw your own conclusion as to whether that is taken out of context or if that's how the officers feel about these rescues. And the final comment, it's like taking a spoonful of water out of Lake Ontario. The police approach to arrest their way out of it, one bad guy at a time, reducing the complexity of this issue to individual bad men and not looking at or addressing systemic issues or root causes which contribute to trafficking. Again, please come to your own conclusions as to whether this is an effective approach and at what cost and what amount of resources. So the next type of rescue that I will talk about is catfishing. So this is an example from 2016, Calgary Police. And the headline on this slide is, I know it's scary for you. It has to be Calgary Police to an escort during this raid. So I'll read from the media report at this time because I think it captures quite well what happened. So in October 2016, a group of men sat in a Calgary hotel room with printouts of escort advertisements. At least one man was armed. The men called the ads one by one, setting up appointments with each woman who answered. But when the women arrived at the hotel, they were met with a lecture, not paid work. I know it's scary for you. It has to be, said one of the police to an escort. You walked into a room where a man had a gun on his belt. I'm a good guy, but a lot of them won't be. The men were law enforcement. They targeted a total of 41 women in Operation Northern Spotlight. One by one, the police hope to entice another person to leave the world's oldest profession. This helps us to identify potential victims and provide an exit, Calgary Police said. But there's another reason the police want to speak with these women, and it makes the victim's hair stand on its head, stand on end. Simply put, the information they give police could be the only way investigators can identify them if they later turn up dead. Now, this is another widely held sentiment I have heard from police officers over the years, which again leaves me speechless. Instead of doing their job of addressing the violence right before their eyes, there's an assumption that the fate of a sex worker is a homicide victim, and they're thinking ahead of ways to make their homicide investigations easier when time comes. And this leaves me speechless. So back to the media report, while none of these women faced charges resulting from the night, 47 people were charged with 135 offenses in a sting operation last year while trying to hire sex workers. The vast majority of the sex trade is taking place online now, which makes locating and identifying victims is not defined, that much more difficult because of the anonymity involved, said the Calgary Police. From a law enforcement perspective, it's almost impossible to locate sex trade offenders. It's a very labor-intensive effort. So we won't be giving up, but we'll do all we can and come back and try again tomorrow night. So I'll just share one more confounding example. This one is from Victoria, British Columbia. It's a recent one, July 2020. And this rescue raid was carried out in the midst of the pandemic. So this is another cautionary tale of a sex work organization which had a working relationship with their local police department and were caught quite off guard that the police in Victoria would carry out this kind of raid. And perhaps it was just a coincidence that the cuts to the police budget were before Victoria City Council at the same time. Again, going back to the cash cow that anti-trafficking is for police and how hard it is for the average person to advocate against defunding anti-trafficking initiatives. So these strategies, you can probably gather by now, are based on deception and manipulation, as evidenced by police posing as sex worker clients in hotel rooms or the shock and awe raids on indoor sex work venues. And so these actions foster distrust and adversarial relationships with law enforcement. So now we'll look at what police think they are doing or say they are doing in their own words. So here's an example from Halifax Police, January 2014. While there are no charges out of Operation Spotlight, police say the operation accomplished another goal, a chance to remind the women about services in the community that can help them get out of the industry. Hamilton Police, 2016, investigators connected with several women working in the sex trade locally. However, none of the women identified as being involved in human trafficking. Hamilton Police also conducted John sweeps, so that's picking up the purchasers of sex, which resulted in the arrest of 6 male parties for communicating to obtain sexual services. And then finally, Calgary in 2016, Operation Northern Spotlight is a national effort from Canadian law enforcement to get information on the men and women to continue to work in the high-risk world of the sex trade. So this is a colossal failure, this type of strategy, and here are some of the reasons why. While state-sanctioned violence under the guise of anti-trafficking doesn't work. Manipulating and traumatizing sex workers is not relationship and trust building. It contributes to the underreporting of actual violence. So if it's not trafficking that's occurring, it's some other kind of violence, women aren't going to naturally reach out to police officers who have been involved in this type of enforcement action. It increases systemic vulnerability to trafficking by driving the sex trade further underground to evade police detection. It's created without the input of sex workers. Sex workers are well positioned to be able to identify predators in the sex industry. This is not the way you do it, and police are unwilling to hear from sex workers' expertise. It demonstrates little to no understanding of the sex industry. You hear police in some of those slides talking about getting women out of the sex industry. That is not the job of police officers. If someone's leaving the sex industry, transitioning to other employment or income, that's a long process that takes time. It takes a lot of employment supports. It harms the women it purports to help. This is a very gendered practice. Police are targeting women primarily in these rescue raids. It has consequences for public health. We, over the years at SWAN, have had so many challenges in distributing condoms because sex workers are fearful of these raids and keeping condoms on the premises. It addresses trafficking on an individual level, contingent on the victim, villain, and hero narrative. And there's an unclear purpose. It looks as if this is very little to do with trafficking, but the police, in their own words, are very explicit as to how they target the sex industry. And even they don't quite understand that how, but they're being upfront about it nevertheless. So some of the systemic outcomes that we see with this is these raids make great headlines and they fuel the perception that trafficking, sex trafficking in the sex industry is of epidemic proportions. You see here, this is Stats Canada using police reported human trafficking statistics as official trafficking statistics in Canada. And surely by now, when you can see where and how the police are going into these establishments, the unreliability of relying on police reported statistics as Canada's official human trafficking statistics. But how many of these police reported cases actually result in prosecutions? So from 2016 to 2018 in Canada, there were 45 trafficking specific convictions. So this was a study carried out by 2 criminologists in BC. I rarely use any trafficking statistics because of differing definitions of what constitutes trafficking and a multitude of other reasons, but this statistics I do rely on because of the quantifiable and reliable and verifiable nature of it. You can literally count how many cases have gone through the Canadian courts. So there are many reasons why there aren't more convictions, but I think one of them certainly can be, if there's certainly as much trafficking as we're led to believe, surely that there would be more convictions, particularly as the legal system improved since 2006 in terms of successful convictions. So now just moving to the end of the presentation nearly. I'm going to talk about some advocacy that SWAN has done in this area. There's been some improvement, but there's much more to do. So the first area that we have advocated in, I'll call the tag team approach. This involves multiple agencies such as municipal bylaw officers, police officers, and Canada Border Services officers all working together on these raids and rescues. In Vancouver, in Greater Vancouver, we have had some success breaking up this tag team approach. In the city of Vancouver, we don't have bylaws, police, and Canada Border Services carrying them out anymore. However, it is extremely difficult to break up the tag team approach between police and Canada Border Services. These are systems that are beyond our control, and it's really difficult to address, especially given the lack of oversight, particularly with Canada Border Services. So an attempt to break up this tag team of police and Canada Border Services carrying out anti-trafficking raids was attempted in Vancouver. The city of Vancouver had adopted an access without fear policy, and the Vancouver Police Department were encouraged to adopt one as well. The Vancouver Police Department, with its own board and governance structure, was separate from the city. So it created its own access without fear guidelines. However, astoundingly, the Vancouver Police Department access without fear guidelines reads more as a rationale of why the Vancouver Police Department collaborates with Canada Border Services rather than encouraging those with unstable immigration status to come forward and report violence, exploitation, or trafficking. So generally speaking, we've had very different outcomes of SWAN challenging this particular anti-trafficking approach. I'll share two very different stories. And the first one I titled Proceed with Caution, and it involves the Vancouver Police Department. So in the early 2000s, Vancouver had a very particular context that doesn't exist in other communities across the country. It was in the aftermath of a serial killer who targeted and murdered many, many women from Vancouver's downtown east side. So there was an opportunity in Vancouver at that time that municipal policy, police policy, and just the community at large needed to change to address what had happened and to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. So a part of that change and acknowledgement involved the Vancouver Sex Work Enforcement Guidelines. So these sex work enforcement guidelines passed in 2013 stated that sex work among consenting adults was not an enforcement priority. So there was a perception across Canada that the Vancouver Police Department were the kinder, gentler police agency, and this perception persists to this day. However, human trafficking in these guidelines was an enforcement priority. And as is typical with many who either are unwilling or incapable of differentiating sex work from trafficking, it was behind the scenes with migrant sex workers, business as usual. The raids continued to be carried out, although not in plain sight. So the police were smart enough to stop raiding the municipally licensed massage parlors because that generated too much public scrutiny and shifted their raids behind the scenes to micro brothels, so apartments and condos where migrant sex workers with precarious immigration status worked. So our organization knew exactly what was going on, and we continued to seek accountability around the continuing raids, particularly the tag team approach, where Vancouver Police Department would go in and raid migrant sex workers, and then Canada Border Services would show up when they were determined or they refused to perform the role of a trafficking victim, and pick the women up and bring them straight to detention or deportation in immigration holding centers or the provincial jail. So in 2017, we started to receive dozens and dozens of reports of very violent robberies. So here was a situation that needed a criminal justice response. Women were coming to us and stating, police will only care about us when we are dead. So we brought this case to the Vancouver Police Department, and they could not help themselves. They flipped the robbery investigation into a trafficking investigation, as an international trafficking investigation is a jewel in the crown, so to speak. The Canada Border Services were called in. They removed one woman, at least that we know of, possibly others. So here's my caution in working with police around anything really, but particularly around anti-trafficking. When we sought accountability of how the robbery investigation turned into the trafficking investigation, this is what happened to us. So first I'll read the Vancouver Police Department's official synopsis of what happened on the bottom. The counter-exploitation unit received information regarding 2 male suspects robbing female sex trade workers at apartments. Suspects were identified by major crimes, resulting in the exposure of an international sex trade and human trafficking boss. Liaison with other agencies and advocacy groups is ongoing. This is what the liaison with us looked like. We were threatened with criminal liability, obstruction of justice, and an investigation initiated of section 286.2 of the prostitution laws, receiving material benefit for providing counseling and direction. So we lawyered up. We retained a prominent lawyer, very experienced in police litigation. It took 6 months for the threat of the investigation to go away. And this was quite a shocking development when in Canada, the prostitution laws were passed in 2014, and there was some concern at that time that potentially sex work organizations could be criminalized. And then that it happened in Vancouver, while the myth persisted that the Vancouver Police Department were the kinder, gentler police force, when it comes to the non-enforcement of sex work laws, could not be any further from the reality of the ground at that time. But also, I need to provide a little bit of a larger context of the Vancouver Police Department at the time and the sensitivity about its anti-trafficking work. So here we have Constable Jim Fisher from the Counter-Exploitation Unit, who served there from 2011 to 2016. And I would be remiss if I did not say that he came under investigation for his sexual misconduct with a young woman who had been trafficked previously. So here he is receiving an award from the Attorney General and Minister of Justice at the time, Suzanne Anton, for his work in busting up a trafficking ring. To when he then went and victimized the trafficking victims, he was sentenced to 20 months in jail, convicted of the breach of trust and sexual exploitation, which did not include a number of state charges. There were 3 other counter-exploitation officers at the time that were accused of deceiving investigators with false statements during the VPD's investigation into Fisher, with 2 suspected of corruption. In the end, none of these charges were laid, and they were just moved to another unit to continue working. Another counter-exploitation officer, one of the authors of the guidelines that I spoke about previously, wrote a character statement for Jim Fisher in his sentencing hearing. So there was a lot going on with the Vancouver Police Department in regard to anti-trafficking at that time. So I think you could understand why they didn't appreciate SWAN seeking accountability about the anti-trafficking actions that they were undertaking at the time. So now I have a more positive outcome, which I call some success until it's not, because you never know when this is going to flip. Back in 2015, there was another police agency who participated in Operation Northern Spotlight. After the women came to us and shared the impacts of that raid and years of raids, we met with that police agency to deconstruct. Why did you carry out the raid? How did you carry it out? Where did you get the information from? They admitted that it was on some tips previously that did not amount to anything, but since other agencies were doing this, they did it as well. They went online, they chose women from adult sites. I don't think that they were aware at the time that many of the pictures on those sites are stock photos. In this conversation, the police agency admitted, quote, self-generated work on quiet nights. We went in and did sex work training, not human trafficking training, so that they would be able to understand the realities of the sex trade. And we created informed alternatives. So the raids have stopped. We are able at times to bring forward the actual violence that sex workers are experiencing in this municipality. And we deem this some success, of course, until it's not. So the final slide is recommendations after hearing all of this. So what is a better way? So I recommend stopping raids and rescues and take an evidence-based approach. We ask that the police, if there's any here today, to educate yourselves, learn the difference between trafficking and sex work, educate yourselves about root causes of trafficking, and realize that the use of blunt use of force through the criminal justice arm of the state is not the way to address these labor abuses and exploitation. We don't see police using this particular strategy to address labor exploitation in other sectors such as farming or constructions. So why is it used here, and why does society accept this? And I think it's often because largely as a society, we have bought into the victim, villain, hero narrative attached to trafficking. So for police to educate themselves, here's a new resource, or for others, that I suggest, and it's from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women. It's their latest version of their anti-trafficking review, which is all about traffickers. So who are traffickers? And I think you will be quite surprised that all of these firsthand stories from many countries around the world paint a very different picture of who we are led to believe traffickers are versus the reality. In terms of respecting sex workers, this can include believing sex workers when they're not trafficked, including sex workers in anti-trafficking policy making, acknowledging that sex workers are best positioned to identify predators. Respect sex workers and stop using them to gather intelligence. I have had police officers outrightly tell me the only reason they're interested in building relationships with sex workers is for sex workers to rat people out. Respecting sex workers involves stop using them for charge approval and then throwing them under the bus when they're no longer useful to investigations. And just to note that respecting sex workers and addressing human trafficking is not mutually exclusive. For community organizations, my recommendations are firstly to self-reflect. I see many community organizations these days saying they take a decolonial and or a trauma-informed approach. I would love to have a conversation with any of the organizations listening today, how collaborating with police on these anti-trafficking initiatives is a decolonial or a trauma-informed approach. I'm really struggling to understand this. And if you are in partnership with police, do the people you serve feel the police are the good guys? Have you asked the sex workers you're serving? Have you asked the Indigenous women you're serving if they see the police as the good guys? Have you asked the racialized youth? Have you asked the migrant workers? I recommend using less lip service and engaging in meaningful action. So I've started to see a shift in some anti-trafficking organizations saying that they differentiate between sex work and trafficking, but they stop short. They're not acknowledging their complicity in creating and informing the harmful policy and practice over the years, and they're not addressing the harms to sex work communities. One way that they can do that, and they're also stopping short, is supporting decriminalization as a way to address trafficking, coming out with position statements or public acknowledgements of the harms that have been done. Criminalization of the sex industry leads to an environment where trafficking, exploitation, and violence thrives. Decriminalization can open up paths to those in the sex industry being able to access employment standards and have a better avenue to address those labor excuses that abuses that don't involve the police. So I just realized that I'm nearly at time now. I won't play this video. This video was created by SWAN. It outlines the very problematic nature of these police raids and rescues, and it talks about people, really being affected by the issue of human trafficking, wanting to do something about it, but the message from this video is not in this way. So I think maybe one of the organizers can share the video link in the chat box.
Yep, I've done it.
Okay, great, with a companion guide.
Yep.
And that is my contact information, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much. There was so much information to take in there, and I know that you took a considerable risk in saying yes to the invitation to speak today and in choosing the content and the topics that you did. So I want to voice our appreciation of CNEE and the appreciation of everyone who's here today, because there's some really great learnings that we can take from what you shared. So we have had a few questions coming in through the chat box. I'm going to try and facilitate a discussion here. Are you okay to stay for an extra 5 minutes, Alison?
Sure.
Yeah, awesome. So one of the questions was, you were speaking about some guidelines towards the end, I think before you brought up the best practices slide, and someone was just looking for those guidelines.
Mm-hmm. I can share that with you, and perhaps you could send it out instead of.
Perfect.
Yeah, so just very briefly, the Vancouver Police Department guidelines, sex enforcement guidelines, have been now superseded by BC-wide provincial sex work enforcement guidelines. However, they exist on paper only. It is a policy that has been adopted by RCMP and provincial police. I would say most officers in BC, if you ask them, they probably wouldn't know it existed. However, we do have something on paper to hold police accountable for erring more towards a non-enforcement approach compared to, let's say, the very harmful policing practices that we see in Ontario. So I can share the BC provincial guidelines to the organizers after.
Great. We'll send that out through the confirmation, like the email to all participants. For those of you who have to leave us, who have the hard leave at 3, thanks for joining us today. For those of you who can stay on, we'll work through some of the questions here. So I'm just going through some of the ones that were left in the chat box. You can also use the raise hand function on Zoom if you would like to speak your question. So the first question that came through was, what about targeting hotels? There are police-led strategies that target hotels as a place of mandatory reporting. For example, putting signs up that say, this hotel reports human trafficking. I find this problematic. However, it continues to come up.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We see that with Bill, I think it's Bill 251 in Ontario, and it's recently been adopted in Manitoba as well. That, again, needs a lot of attention. It needs a lot of advocacy. It is just straight out targeting of the sex industry, and a very narrow understanding of trafficking. But for more than that, it allows police warrantless entry into hotel rooms and access to the list of anyone staying in the hotel. So from a civil liberties perspective, it's also very concerning. Any of us could be staying in a hotel. I actually had a colleague who was in Montreal hotel room, and she was awakened at 2 o'clock with the police barging in, allegedly looking for a youth trafficking victim. So this is so far gone beyond anything that would purportedly address trafficking. So I think it's just very concerning on everyone's part, and it needs attention from all of us, whether we have connections to the sex industry, we're sex workers, or even if we're not.
Thank you. And I've had a couple of questions come in with regards to like advice for working with police. So here I have, could you please elaborate more on your point regarding self-reflection, and how would you envision a collaboration with law enforcement? We can't leave them out of the anti-human trafficking responses. And then could you give best advice for service agencies on how to work with police?
I'm not sure I have that I'm not sure I have that advice anymore. I worked with police over 10 years. I'm no longer hopeful. I tried so many different ways, did so many different trainings, engaged on so many different levels, from frontline officers to like assistant commissioners of the RCMP and BC. I feel as long as there's systemic racism in policing, as long as they have some of those institutional issues that they need to admit to and work on, I don't actually have a lot of hope for working with police in a conducive way to address human trafficking. That may seem like a radical idea for some, and I don't suggest organizations do what we do. However, we navigate anti-trafficking, including removing women from exploitative situations, without the aid of police. Again, not something I'm suggesting for others to do, but through being burned too many times, from coming under investigation as an organization who thought we were working with police in a community-minded way. We thought they were our partners. We have just found a way to address anti-trafficking without involving the police in any way. But I know each organization is different, and I don't expect other organizations to take the path that we have.
Yeah, so it sounds like your approach is to sort of make police intervention redundant because they're not needed. Yeah, thanks. The non-punishment principle holds states accountable for upholding survivors' rights and ensuring they are not punished for any crimes committed during their trafficking experience. How would sex workers' rights being violated in Canada show the state's failure in upholding the non-punishment principle, aside from the clear example of police collaborating with CBSA and the use of deportation?
That's a really great question. I haven't found that to be our experience. Some of the trafficked women that we worked with, if they didn't perform the role of a trafficking victim, it very quickly switched in that police interaction between the police seeing them as a victim and the police seeing them as a criminal. I'll just share one example, and because I talked a little bit about women being of use to police up until the point that charge approval came about. So we had one woman who worked really closely with police on a number of charges. They actually even secured a temporary residence permit for her. Fast forward some time later, the charges got approved. She needed to renew her visa or to see if that was possible. She could not get a hold of anyone at the Vancouver Police Department to get any information about the visa or if there was a possibility of extension. She was thereafter shortly raided by police who turned her over to Canada Border Services, and she's now in the process of being deported. That was a very clear example how she was of use to them when they needed her to be, and when they weren't, when she wasn't, they called in their friends at CBSA. So we've also had experiences with women who were trafficked, and again, unless they perform that trafficking victim role, they can very well, particularly with immigration detention, it doesn't matter when the trafficked woman was trying to tell her story to authorities, just very, very harsh punishment, being held in detention, and the risk of being criminally charged was also there as well. And I might add that her trafficker was an ex-RCMP officer.
Thank you so much, Alison. We're now at 7 minutes past 3, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. I have dropped your email once again in the chat box for anyone who missed it. So if you do have further questions or comments, you want to reach out to Alison, you could do so, info@swanvancouver.ca. If you want to watch this recording, we will make that available probably next week. So thank you so much for your time and the benefit of your experience and expertise today. We will be following up with you. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you also for your time and participation, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.